There's a lot of great reading lists out there for how to be an anti-racist. One amazing book that never makes the list is Shawn Copeland's Enfleshing Freedom. If you want to learn how to make your theology anti-racist, you need to check out this book. Now, before we start, let me say the last thing the world needs is a white cisgender man explaining the work of a black woman as theologian. No, you need to hear from Shawn Copeland directly. So better to stop this video, order her book and read it yourself, or check out one of her lectures that are on YouTube. I've got a link to one in the description, or follow the other link I've included to hear summaries of the first 3 chapters of her book from an African perspective. Those are for sure better than what I can do. The challenge is that her work is an academic one. It's a book of theology, so there's certain things that you're expected to know before you read it, and that might make it less engaging for a general audience. I'm hopefully going to give a Cole's Notes version of this. Definitely not going to do it justice, but maybe it will pique your interest and get you thinking. Plus, there is certain value in having a white guy telling other white folks that you've got to hear what Copeland is saying. That itself is a sad reality, but if we listen to Copeland, perhaps as a church we can address those injustices of race and gender. Let's hear what Copeland has to say. Shawn Copeland is a professor emerita of systematic theology at Boston College. She was the first African American and first African American woman to serve as president of the Catholic Theological Society of America. Her first chapter is titled Body, Race, and Being, and in it Copeland's focus is on the body, particularly black women's bodies. She takes the black woman's body in America and uses that as a prism through which she approaches theology. Now that could get criticized, maybe some might accuse it of identity politics. Shouldn't theology, the study of God, be about bigger, more universal things? Shouldn't we talk about all of humanity and not be so narrowly focused? But that's precisely the problem we have. The Enlightenment thinkers wrote about the human condition in ways that they thought were universal. But of course, they're white European men, and they're writing to other white European men about white European men. So the experience of women and other genders, of people of different races and cultures, that was either ignored, considered irrelevant, or deemed deviant. Black women's bodies in particular were objectified, exoticized, and dehumanized by the scientific and academic communities of their day. Those Enlightenment thinkers have had significant impact on our modern-day theology, along with all of their assumptions about race and gender. Another reason for focusing on the body is that the church has been historically somatophobic, having a fear of the flesh. There's a tendency in Christian tradition to view the soul as good and the body as bad. That dualism is a heresy, but we've been tempted by it throughout the ages. But Jesus is God made flesh, and that incarnation is central to our faith as Christians. And in a negrophobic society, seeing the light of divine revelation embodied in black women is critical. Not just because it can teach us a different perspective, but Copeland says it does more. It transforms the way that we relate to each other. Chapter 2 is tough. Copeland shows us what happens when black women's bodies are objectified, when they're viewed as objects of property or objects of production or objects of reproduction or objects of sexual violence. She reports some of the first-hand accounts of women who were emancipated from slavery. They are hard to hear, and Copeland says that these stories run the risk of fostering a voyeuristic sentimentality. That she can't talk about bodies and give honor to those bodies without recounting, remembering the pain and torture those bodies were subjected to. I'm not going to describe any of those stories here because to hold those stories as sacred, I believe you need to hear it from Copeland and read these yourself. She has some amazing points in this second chapter, and one is that slavery deformed a basic conviction of Christianity, that we are all created in the image and likeness of God. Slavery, and by extension white supremacy, defaces the image of God in black people, and it is blasphemous. The Bible was manipulated to legitimate and sanctify the bondage of black bodies. To this end, many ministers advocated a Christianity that sought to unmake the God image in Africans. On many plantations, enslaved people were forbidden to worship. Baptism was denied because it was viewed as a threat, and slaveholders tried to place themselves between God and their slaves, punishing them for praying and singing. We refuse to see God in our black neighbor, and instead we make God in our own image. That is idolatry. In chapter 3, Copeland turns to the body of Christ, the Word made flesh, and she talks about the importance of seeing that body as a human body, with all the same marks of humanity that anyone would have. Jesus, too, had a gender, a race, a sex, a sexuality, and a culture. We tend to dismiss those things when we think of Jesus. We need to remember that Jesus experienced pain and also desire. And a large part of his ministry was healing and touching bodies. He handled, touched, and embraced their marked bodies. And through those encounters, he ended up transforming village bodies. The one who was sick gets returned to the village, and it heals the whole community. And Jesus performed his masculinity in ways that opposed patriarchal expressions of maleness. He didn't use coercive power and control. He overturned family structure. He chose women as his disciples. He emptied himself. None of the things associated with traditional masculinity. Our current globalized society continues to objectify and commodify bodies, especially women of color from poor countries, and those who are ostracized for their sexuality. Their bodily agency and autonomy is debased. If we are to bring a message of hope to the world, it means welcoming to the table people in all of their marked peculiarities of race, gender, sex, sexuality, and culture. When you come to Christ's table, you don't leave all those other parts of you behind. Those parts of who you are as a human being with flesh and color and pain and desire, all of that becomes part of the body of Christ. If my sister's mark of sexuality must be obscured, if my brother's mark of race must be disguised, if my sister's mark of culture must be repressed, then we are not the flesh of Christ. It is only in the union of all the particular members that the beauty of Christ's body is complete. Love of neighbor was the hallmark of early Christianity. Our focus was on charity and almsgiving as remedies to injustice. Charity is great, but it doesn't address all the underlying structural issues of society, so we moved on to a social justice model in order to engage in that deeper structural work. Copeland, however, says that social justice isn't enough. What we need is solidarity. Solidarity is standing with our neighbor, especially with those who are othered. We are moved by their pain to confront and address what is oppressing them. We shoulder their suffering, just as we might carry the cross. The dominant powers of oppression in society work to separate us from each other, to sever the members of the body. White against black, men against women, straight against gay, cis against trans. We oppose the powers of oppression when we are rejoined, remembered in that body of Christ. As Christians, how do we join in the body of Christ sacramentally? Well, in communion. Lord's Supper, Eucharist, call it what you will. Communion, or the Eucharist, is all about bodies, lifting up the body of Christ, tasting the body of Christ, becoming one in the body of Christ. Racism, however, opposes Eucharist. Racism is quite literally lethal to bodies, to black bodies, and to the body of Christ, because it severs and it divides us from each other. Copeland here tells the stories in this chapter of lynching. Stories that you need to hear, but like slavery, I think you need to read yourselves. Copeland joins in the question raised by James Cone in his book The Cross and the Lynching Tree, another heartbreaking and amazing book, asking how the North American church could not see the connection between a black person they lynched and Jesus Christ hanging on the cross. How could good Christians twist the tree of the cross into a lynching tree? The idolatrous practices of slavery, lynching, and white racist supremacy violate black bodies, blaspheme against God, and defame the body of Christ. But Eucharist, communion, is the countersign to the devaluation and violence directed toward the exploited, despised black body. As Christ's body, when we join together in communion and become one body, we embrace with love and hope those who in their bodies have been despised and marginalized. As Christ's body, we pulse with new life. As his body, we stand in solidarity to oppose all divisive segregation of bodies. Eucharistic solidarity teaches us to imagine, to hope for, and to create new possibilities. Because that solidarity enfolds us. Rather than dismiss others, we act in love. Rather than refuse others, we respond in acts of self-sacrifice, committing ourselves to the long labor of creation, to the enfleshment of freedom. Here at the Lord's table, we are reordered, remembered, restored, and made one. This has been Shawn Copeland's Enfleshing Freedom. What I loved most about it was the strength of the language she used to talk about racism, white supremacy, and slavery as, not just sins, but blasphemies. They are idolatry, and how much it corrupted our witness of faith and our whole understanding of who God is. But she also she gives that critique. She also says, hey, in this Eucharist, in this main sacrament of our church, we can counter that racism. We can remember that we are joined all together and that there is no dividing neighbor against each other. I think that is powerful and convicting and hopeful. I hope it's piqued your interest a bit. If you geek out about theology, you definitely have to check out this book. For other church members, I really recommend that you read James Cone's The Cross and the Lynching Tree. That one is a very hard mirror for the white church to look at. It'll be emotional, but there's no justice without doing so. So, thanks for watching.